means that 2 out of every 3 species on Earth that's ever been described is in this one phylum. Yeah, massive. You'll see up in the lab, I have these trays with insects. I've got them scattered all over the room because I don't have any counter space in there. You're going to have trouble like maneuvering your microscope and stuff, but you'll see the lab is chocked full. There's a ton of stuff you look at. This is a massive, massive group. So the name arthropoda, what does arthro mean? If you have arthritis, what hurts? Your joints, right? These are jointed legs, right? They have an exoskeleton, a chitinous exoskeleton with jointed appendages. Those jointed appendages are operated by little muscles that work in antagonistic pairs exactly the same way that your jointed skeleton is. What kind of muscles do you, for the most part, have that operate your joints? Like what do you call a muscle that pulls to bend a joint?
Extensor.
A flexor, and a muscle that pulls to straighten a joint is an extensor. Guess what arthropods have? Flexors and extensors on their little jointed body so that they can bend and straighten their joints, right? Okay, no big surprise here. They're bilaterally symmetrical. They're triploblastic, which means that they have 3 germ layers. They have mesoderm. They have this same type of determinate cleavage, presumably, that nematodes and tardigrades and onychophorans have, these ecdysozoans, right? You don't see that idiosyncratic cleavage outside of them, even though Campbell says that aceals have idiosyncratic cleavage, but that's got to be something else, because they're not even remotely related to these. So, for the most part, as far as I'm concerned, I'm only going to refer to this type of determinate cleavage as that you find in ecdysozoans. They have an open gut. They're protostomes. The blastopore becomes the mouth. They have a hemocoel. Remember, these guys have an open circulatory system, so the blood is just loose in the body with a little dorsal blood vessel that pumps it around, right? That large cavity that has the blood in it is called a hemocoel. What does that mean? A blood cavity. That's what it means, right? They also have a true coelom, presumably, but it's a very reduced coelom compared to the kind that you'd find in a mollusk or an annelid. The body is segmented. This is why they were thought to be related to annelids for a long time. And we're going to talk a lot about this idea of tagmatization. A tagma is just a fused segment. So you'll notice that the ancestral condition probably for all arthropods is to have something that kind of looks like the middle part of a centipede, where you have segment with 1 pair of appendages, segment with 1 pair of appendages, segment with 1 pair of appendages. And what's happened evolutionarily is that segments fuse together to make more complex segments, and appendages get exapted. Exaptation is the modification of an existing structure to do a new function. So as you're going through and looking at all of the little mouth parts, feeding appendages on your crayfish, you'll see that things like maxillipeds and maxilla and even mandibles are actually walking legs that have taken on a new function. In the case of horseshoe crabs, if I can get the little horseshoe crabs I've got upstairs to eat for you, you'll see that these guys actually still eat with the same legs that they walk with. Which really drives home this idea that with the exception of wings and insects, all arthropod appendages basically are modified walking legs. And of course, this idea of jointed appendages, that's where their name comes from. They have flexor and extensor muscles, I already mentioned. The exoskeleton is made of chitin, right? And sometimes you have the chitin reinforced with calcium carbonate salts, right? So things like crustaceans and stuff have a lot of calcium carbonate in their exoskeletons, not just chitin. By far the most species of any phylum. Interestingly enough, this is the only group of invertebrate animals, the insects, that figured out how to fly. There are no flying cnidarians. There are no flying platyhelminths. There's no flying annelids or mollusks, right? Nobody else within the invertebrates figured out how to fly. Within vertebrate animals, you realize powered flight has evolved several different times. In pterosaurs, in bats, birds, right? There's at least 3 or 4 different origins of powered flight within vertebrate animals. But invertebrates is such a very small part of diversity. For some reason, within invertebrates, they never figured out how to fly except in this one group. This, presumably a single origin of powered flight within invertebrate animals. It would be at the base of insects. And these guys mostly have separate sexes. I have a very hard time. You'll see with your little crayfish, you're going to say, is it a boy crayfish or a girl crayfish? It's very easy to sex them. I got crickets upstairs that you're going to kill and look at, and you'll see the crickets are very easy to sex as being a boy cricket or a girl cricket. So I always think of arthropods in terms of separate sexes. There are a couple hermaphrodites, and I had always forgot what they were. Anybody know? Can you think of an arthropod that's hermaphroditic? Barnacles. Some of the barnacles. And yet the reason I don't think of them as being hermaphroditic is because you know how barnacles are kind of cemented in spot, right? It's basically like a little teeny tiny shrimp that's inside of this little house, and it's glued, it's sessile, it's stuck in one spot all the time. And so how do they have sex, do you think? They have internal fertilization. They don't like just release gametes into the water. How are you going to do that if you can't like get up and go over to where your mate is over there? Basically, they have these like huge penises that they can reach way over there. So I always picture, and they're supposed to be like, relative to their body size, it's like the largest penis, I think, in the animal kingdom since on a barnacle. Look it up. Let's see if I'm right. But so I always picture these barnacles sticking their penis way over there, and so I'm picturing them being kind of like boy barnacles and girl barnacles, but not really. They're actually, I think at least within some species they have both sex organs, right? So just because they have big penises doesn't mean they're all boy, right? Okay, so just to show you an example, I mentioned briefly, I think last week, ammonites, which is a group of fossil cephalopods. If you go back, to sort of very early, maybe like 500 million years ago or something, you're looking in the Cambrian when you have all of these different animal phyla that appear very quickly. There's some groups that left just tremendously good fossil records, and we know them very well from fossil records. Ammonites in the cephalopods, and trilobites within arthropods. So this is an extinct lineage of arthropods. Put it in here so that you'll know it, so that you'll see it. You don't have to really know it, though. This is what I want you to focus on. So we're going to take the phylum Arthropoda and we're going to divide it into subphyla. And the subphyla are going to be the cheliceriforms or chelicerates, myriapods, and then what I'm going to call pancrustacea. I'll show you this in a second. So I mentioned briefly a minute ago, you can see that the way Campbell does this, and I think this is the way it is in Brooker too. I don't like this, right? There's now a significant amount of evidence that insects is a group inside of crustaceans, and crustaceans as historically defined as paraphyletic unless you include insects. This is a very new idea. Up until recently, there was this group called Juniramians, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, that postulated that myriapods and insects were each other's closest relatives. But there was a great paper that came out in 2005 that seriously debunked this idea and said that insects are derived from inside of crustaceans. I got in a big argument with the author of this section in Campbell because when they put the 9th edition together, they left it like this. And there's even language in there that suggests that crustaceans is a monophyletic group. And so I pointed out this 2005 paper and told him that they should have updated it. And his argument was that when that paper came out, it was too preliminary and the jury was still out. Well, there's a 2010 paper that supports the 2005 paper with a whole bunch of extra data. And so he conceded that based on the 2010 paper that the book should be changed, and he'll do it for the 10th edition of Campbell, so whatever. So supposedly Campbell's going to catch up to this. I want you to catch up to it right now, though. So instead of having four, we're going to have 3, chelicerates and myriapods, and then we're going to call this group pancrustacea. What does pan mean? All crustaceans, which is going to include insects. So insects we're going to treat as a class inside of the subphylum Pancrustacea. I'm using the name Pancrustacea in order to make it very clear I'm not talking about Crustacea as it was historically defined. I'm talking about all of the old Crustacea plus insects. I'm going to throw insects in there. So Hexapoda or Insecta is going to be a class inside of the subphylum Pancrustacea. We're not going to treat Crustacea and Hexapoda as 2 separate subphyla.
What did the broker say about it?
It's the same as this. I had somebody look it up, unfortunately. You can tell this is a pet peeve of mine. That's why I'm frustrated. I was thinking Booker might be ahead on it, but it's not. I can tell you at the University of Chicago, they teach it the way I'm going to do it right now with you as Pancrustacea. It's in the lab manual that way. Just follow the lab manual. This is probably the most serious departure that I'm going to make from the textbook. And the author of this part of Campbell conceded that this is wrong. To me personally, I'll show you his email if you want. He conceded to me personally that this is wrong, but he said he couldn't get it into the 9th edition. That when that 2010 paper came out, that the 9th edition had already gone to press and he couldn't fix it. Okay, so let's go through those. So we got phylum. You're getting good with these names, right? Phylum, Arthropoda. Subphyla, chelicerates, myriapods, hand crustacean. Yeah? Here's the chelicerates. This is the first subphylum. They don't have antennae. They have 6 pairs of appendages. The first pair of appendages are called chelicerae. It's not very hard to remember. They're chelicerates, right? And you're going to see these on the horseshoe crab, on the spider, on the scorpion. You're going to see these upstairs. The second pair of appendages in most of them, at least within the arachnids, are modified to form what are called pedipalps. Horseshoe crabs, you probably just call them walking legs. So horseshoe crabs, you can kind of think have 5 pairs of walking legs rather than really having pedipalps. They still have 6 pairs of appendages, though. They all have 4 pairs of walking legs, right? And you'll see that in the case of the horseshoe crab, as I mentioned, they have these little bristles on the top parts of those walking legs. Those bristles are called gnathobases. Gnatho means jaw. They use those to chew their food. So you'll see, in order for the horseshoe crab to chew his food, he actually has to walk like this, because he's using the same legs that he walks with to chew his food. 2 primary body segments, a cephalothorax and an abdomen. So you can imagine on the cephalothorax, if you have these 6 pairs of appendages, what that is evolutionarily is like 6 different segments that have been fused together through tagmatization in order to make a more complex segment, right? Like when you were all in first grade, you learned that, for example, a spider is not an insect. Why? Because a spider has 4 pairs of walking legs. Insects have how many pairs? 6. 6 legs, or 3 pairs, right? Right? And a spider has 2 main body segments, a cephalothorax and an abdomen. An insect has how many body segments? Think back to first grade. 3, right? A head, thorax, and an abdomen, right? You all kind of remember that? All of this different number of body segments and different number of appendages per segment has to come through different ways in which the tagmatization has occurred, in which they've been fused together. Okay, so this is a subphylum. I'm going to give you 2 classes. Merostomata is horseshoe crab, which hopefully you realize has absolutely nothing to do with crabs, right? Crabs are in a class called Malacostrica, which is going to be in the subphylum Pancrustacea. These are chelicerates. These are related to spiders, scorpions. They're not closely related to crabs at all. Yeah, they're called crabs because they're in the water. That's like the only reason. Crabs have 2 pairs of antennae. These don't have any antennae. Crabs and cephalopods, they have 5 pairs of walking legs. These have 4 pairs of walking legs, maybe 5, you could argue, but it's just a completely different body plan. The crab has a body plan that's very similar to the crayfish that you're going to dissect tonight. Very different from this. The genus for horseshoe crabs is Limulus. If you're interested in pharmacy stuff, there's a very important pharmaceutical test called a Limulus test. These guys have a copper-based blood. It's green. They collect them and they bleed them and get that green blood out, and it's used in this pharmaceutical test that I can't remember exactly how it's used, but there's a paper on it in the lab supplements if you're really curious about that. But as a pharmacist, you're going to hear of a Limulus test. Here's Limulus right here. That's his genus name. An interesting group of animals in that you can find 400-million-year-old fossils that look almost exactly like modern horseshoe crabs. So this is a very ancient body form for this particular group of animals. If I said, name me a chelicerate, Limulus would be good. If I say Merostomata, this is probably the only one you could name. Limulus, horseshoe crab, something like that, right? The other major group of chelicerates are arachnids, which are going to be spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites, right? Spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. And when you look at them, they have the same basic body plan. I've got dead horseshoe crabs, dead spiders, dead scorpions up there. Take one of each and put them on a little dissecting pan and convince yourself. Cephalothorax, abdomen. 1 pair of appendages in the front, right? The chelicerae. In a spider, the chelicerae are modified to form fangs, right? Those are the chelicerae on a spider. Pedipalps, 4 pairs of walking legs, right? The chelicerae of a scorpion are right here. These are the pedipalps, 4 pairs of walking legs, cephalothorax, abdomen. Ticks, exactly the same. I've got whole mounts of a tick upstairs. Look at it. Convince yourself. Chelicerae, pedipalps, 4 pairs of walking legs, cephalothorax, abdomen. No antennae in anybody. Yeah. Everybody else is going to have antennae, right? Centipedes and millipedes have one pair. Insects have one pair. All the other crustaceans have two pairs, right? Everybody else has antennae. These are the only guys with no antennae. Yeah. Am I convincing you? Horseshoe crabs belong with these guys. They have nothing to do with real crabs. If you looked at a spider, cephalothorax, abdomen, and you notice some of these features like there's, well, it doesn't really show it. There's a ventral nerve cord again. There's a dorsal circulatory system or heart here. Open circulatory system. One-way digestive tract, so there's a mouth and an anus, right? The chelicerae are fangs. Here are the pedipalps, 4 pairs of walking legs. And of course, in a spider, you have these silk glands that they make their web with. You also notice a respiratory organ here, something called a book lung, because it looks like it has these little divisions that look like little pages. Guess what a horseshoe crab has? How about a book gill? Because it lives in the water, right? When I flip a horseshoe crab over, you'll see it looks like little pages in a book. Flipping, flipping, right? So he has a book gill. These guys have book lungs. You'll see that in the case of insects and myriapods, they have spiracles and trachea, and you'll see that in the case of like crustaceans, like at least the one that you're going to dissect, that there are these big feathery little gills that are up underneath the carapace that are attached to each leg. Nobody outside of the chelicerates has something that's like a book lung. This is a very distinctive feature that you find. There again, you should be going, wow, you know, maybe horseshoe crab really is like a spider, right? The respiratory organ is structurally very similar. Okay, so we had, what phylum are we in? Arthropoda, and we already did the subphylum Chelicerata, which had 2 classes. What were the 2 classes? The one with limulus is Meristomata, and then the one with spider, scorpions, ticks, and mites was Arachnida. Here's the second subphylum, Myriapoda. Myriapoda means a whole bunch of legs, right? So these are going to be the centipedes and millipedes. Kilopodas, the class name for centipedes. Diplopoda, the class name for millipedes. How do you tell a centipede from a millipede? And don't say count its legs, and if it has 100, it's a centipede. If it has 1,000, it's a millipede. That's not right. Centipedes, you'll notice, are flattened. See how their body's flattened? Millipedes are rounded. Yeah? Centipedes appear to have 1 pair of appendages per segment. Millipedes appear to have 2 pairs of appendages per segment. I say appears because in all arthropods there's really only 1 pair of appendages per segment. But here, if you look, and the millipede upstairs, get him to crawl on you, and you'll see that it looks, if you look very carefully on each segment, there's a very thin little line. Each segment is actually 2 segments fused together. Yeah. It appears because of these tagma, because of this fusing of these 2 segments together, he appears to have 2 appendages per segment. So rounded, 2 pairs per segment, flattened, 1 pair per segment. The other primary difference is these guys are all harmless little herbivores, as long as you don't eat one, right? If you eat a millipede, that might not be good. But if you just let him crawl on you, they're totally harmless. They won't do anything, right? Some of these guys are venomous. You have to be careful when you're handling centipedes. And centipedes are all carnivorous. They all hunt and eat other animals. Millipedes are all vegetarian. Okay, so got both of those guys live upstairs for you to play with.
Are those the 2 different classes of the...
Those are the 2 different classes of the subphylum Myriapoda.
Okay.
Okay, and then that brings us to this little thing. If we were doing this 10 years ago, I would have talked to you about this group called Uniramia, which means 1 branch, basically. And I would have told you that the myriapods were closely related to insects. I've already told you that's wrong, though. Insects are a group inside of crustaceans. The idea behind this Uniramia group is that if you look, for example, like this is a cricket's leg, you see that it is unbranched. Whereas if you look at like the leg on a shrimp or a little crayfish or something, you'll see that there are 2 branches. It's what we say biramous. So the idea is, if you looked at the leg of a millipede or a centipede, or you looked at the leg of an insect, they're all uniramous. And so what it says is that centipedes, millipedes, and insects all kind of go together because they have unbranched appendages. They also all have a single pair of antennae. So you'll notice the millipede and the centipede have 1 pair of antennae, so do all of the insects, right? Crustaceans all have 2 pairs of antennae. What are historically called crustaceans have 2 pairs. They also have respiratory organs called trachea, which are like little tubes that come through their body with little openings to the outside called spiracles, and that's what you find in millipedes and centipedes and in insects. We already said in chelicerates you find a book gill or a book lung, and in the case of crustaceans you have these little feather-like gill structures. And then you also have these feeding appendages called mandibles, and they're common in a lot of the insects, although you'll see there's many insects that don't have mandibles or don't have mandibles during a certain part of their life history. And you do find mandibles, for example, in your crayfish too. So mandibles is kind of a problematic one because it's not just something that you'd find in centipedes, millipedes, and insects, but you find it in other groups too. Never in chelicerates, but within the crustaceans you find mandibles.
So are they saying that the antennae was like an ancestral condition and then it was lost throughout, or?
Well, no, what they were saying was this group was united by the fact they have a single pair of antennae. But you're pointing out, in all likelihood, the number of antennae is a convergent trait. It's not a good trait to define the group. But that's what they wanted to define this group Uniramia based on. Clearly, right, you would have to have maybe a reduction in, since insects are a derived group within crustaceans, and probably the ancestral condition for crustaceans is to have 2, and you've lost 1 in.
But they need insects to be monophyletic, so.
But insects is monophyletic, yeah. It's monophyletic, it's crustaceans, it's not monophyletic unless you put them in. Kind of like with the birds and reptiles. Birds is not a problem. The problem is reptiles if you don't put birds in there, right? Crustaceans is a problem. Insects is fine the way it was, right? But crustaceans is not monophyletic unless you add insects. Insects are a derived group within crustaceans. Okay, so let's talk about what makes an insect an insect. Insects have a single pair of antennae. They typically have mandibles, but you'll see you can have highly modified mouth parts in things like flies, right? Have little mouth parts that are almost like little sponges. Butterflies have like these little coiled straws that they suck nectar through. You can have a proboscis like you would have sort of in a mosquito or something. You can have, like in the themithrids and the true bugs, you'll see that they have mouth parts that are specialized for piercing and sucking plant juices, so there's lots of modification. Mandibles are basically like little jaws, right, that basically chew through vegetation. So if you think of something like what a grasshopper has or something, a grasshopper has mandibles, right? And even something like a butterfly would have mandibles when it's a caterpillar, right? So when it's a juvenile, it does have mandibles. It's only as an adult that it doesn't. 3 pairs of walking legs, 3 body segments, right? And the other thing, what do all insects have that really should be on there? 2 pairs of wings, right? So virtually all insects have 2 pairs of wings, right? Wings are not modified walking legs. That's the one exception of a appendage in arthropods that's not a modified walking leg. They're actually just outgrowths of the exoskeleton. Okay, so this kind of shows you the spiracles and the trachea, very much like what you find. So you have these spiracles that are the openings to the outside, and the trachea, which are these little tubes that connect to little air sacs. Looks nothing like a book gill or a book lung, right? This is very similar to what you find in a millipede or a centipede. That's one of the things that led people to think that insects probably were closely related to centipedes and millipedes, right? So this is sort of the old thinking on this, right, where you would have centipedes and millipedes and insects together. These would have been the Uniramia, right? Here would be crustaceans, chelicerates, and then trilobites is that extinct group, right? They even gave names like Mandibulata to this group because this is where you find mandibles. You don't find mandibles in chelicerates, even though there's a lot of members in here that don't have mandibles. Many of them do, right? That's probably wrong. And this is probably closer to right. You'll notice here we have chelicerates actually coming out kind of with centipedes and millipedes, as crazy as that is. Anybody know what everything in the gray boxes used to be called? Take a guess. It starts with a C. Crustaceans. Can you see that crustaceans would not be monophyletic, right? Everything in the gray boxes is not monophyletic. But you could make it monophyletic if you added in Columbella and you add in insects. Right? Insects was fine. Insects is monophyletic all the time. But this group that we referred to as crustaceans would not be monophyletic unless you put insects into them. And then just to make it really clear that we're not talking about the guys in the gray boxes only, we put the word pan in front of it. To make it clear that we're talking about pan crustacea. We're talking about this subphylum now that's going to include not only all of the stuff that we used to call crustaceans, but also the insects. do one of these. Which animal does not have antennae? A lobster, a tick, a millipede, or pick D if you think they all have antennae. Think about where they go. What subphylum does this go into? Pancrustacea. How about this one? Chelicerata. How about this one? Myriapoda. Which subphylum doesn't have antennae? I actually didn't think this was a question. I thought it was going to refer to the insect order. Okay. We're close. I got about another 20 minutes with the arthropods though. So I'm going to give you the rapidito version up in the lab so that you're not completely lost. Don't forget all this. Study this for the next 15 minutes. We're going to meet up there at 10 after 7, right? Study this. Start getting names like Chelicerate, Pancrustacea, Myriapoda, Chilopoda, Diplopoda, Meristomata, Arachnid. Start forcing these names into your head, right? Because this is the lab tonight. Okay, one more. Is there one more? Look and see if your number's lit up. Okay, there we go. So a tick, most of you got it right, is a chelicerate. Chelicerates do not have antennae. Okay, so about 10 after 7.